I'm John Norlock. I'm the interim director of the center, and I welcome you to this year's Richard and Campen Lecture in Architecture and Sculpture. This is a very special event. It's one that occurs usually every other year, but we had one last year, so I can no longer follow that through. But it is one of the highlights of the Baker Norge programming every year. And with us this afternoon are alumni of the School of Architecture, who every year the center sends out a special invitation to gather them to our event. And also with us are members of the Campen family, including Richard Campen, son of Richard N. Campen, and Peter Campen, who was the grandson of Richard N. Campen. And it's through the Campen family and their generosity that our lecture is funded every year. And it's been a day-long event. I mean, it's in some respects very festive. That, excuse me, we began this morning at 9 o'clock with a workshop, Gimme Shelter, that involved the students from John Hay High School who were working with Dean Ponce de Leon on a project about architecture, environment, and how those two interact. And it was this morning in the Twing Ballroom. And a special thanks to Steve Adams, a member of the Baker Nord Guiding Committee, and who brought the idea of having Dean Ponce de Leon come to us. But also Steve was instrumental in getting this workshop together, and would like to thank him especially. And before I step off the podium here, this is the green sheet. This is one of the things I say. This green sheet is sometimes lavender, sometimes yellow, but it's the sheet that tells us who you are, why you're here, and if you could, on your way out, fill this out and let us know. We'll have a new season and a new calendar coming up shortly, and this is one way in which we can let you know what's going on. Now I would like to introduce Sally Levine, who is an instructor in the pre-architecture program and with whom Dean Ponce de Leon met with her class earlier this afternoon. And Sally will take the program from here. Thank you.
There are lots of screens here. Okay, hi. I'm Sally Levine, and I teach the architecture studios offered here through the Art Studios department. This morning, I was delighted to meet Monica Ponce de Leon. I had the opportunity to watch her as she interacted with the high school students from John Hay in a charrette. She immediately engaged the students as she displayed her own enthusiasm for architecture. Then, just prior to this lecture, she met with my pre-architecture students sitting there in the audience, and they had a lively conversation about the relationship between architecture and society. Her ease with students comes as no surprise, as she is the dean and Eliel Saarinen Collegiate Professor at the A. Alfred Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning at the University of Michigan. Before taking the position at Michigan, she was a professor of architecture, director of the Digital Lab, and acting architecture program director at Harvard University. There, she developed the first robotic fabrication lab located in an American architecture school. And for this, she was recognized with the Cooper Hewitt National Design Award in Architecture. The dean earned her Bachelor of Architecture degree from the University of Miami and her Master of Architecture in Urban Design from the Graduate School of Design at Harvard. Her accomplishments are many. In addition to those already mentioned, she has held teaching positions at the Southern California Institute of Architecture, or SCI-Arc, the Rhode Island School of Design, or RISD, Northeastern University, and the Georgia Institute of Technology. She received the Young Architects Award in 1997 and the Emerging Voices Award in 2003 from the Architectural League of New York. She received an Academy Award in Architecture from the American Academy of Arts and Letters and was named a United States Artist Fellow. Her work has been recognized with numerous honors, awards, and citations from, among many, Progressive Architecture, the National AIA, the New York chapter of the AIA, Wallpaper Magazine, ID Magazine, and the Boston Society of Architects. And in 2008, her design for the McAllen Building was named one of the top 10 green projects by the AIA Committee on the Environment. Many of us were introduced to Dean Ponce de Leon through her work as a co-founder of Office Da, and we've continued to follow the impressive output from her current interdisciplinary practice, Monica Ponce de Leon, or MPDL Studio. It seems to me that what separates Dean Ponce de Leon from so many others who talk about the interdisciplinary nature of architecture is the way MPDL Studio embodies that collective philosophy. She teams with an extraordinary and diverse group of individuals with degrees in fine arts, architecture, material systems, environmental design, historic preservation, and urban design. I'm looking forward to hearing her talk about the work that comes from the studio's exceptional environment. We are pleased that Dean Ponce de Leon has come here to speak at the Case Western Reserve University's esteemed series, the Richard N. Campen Lecture in Architecture and Sculpture. Finally, Dean Ponce de Leon is just a fascinating woman, and we're all in for a treat. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Monica Ponce de Leon.
Good evening. Can you guys hear me? I am thrilled to be here tonight. And I have to say I have had a fantastic day. I've learned a lot, and I am really excited to present my work, and I'm hoping that you'll have a lot of questions. I am better doing question and answer than during a lecture. So please think of questions as I talk. So I have lately become very interested in the boundaries between art and architecture, or the lack of boundary between art and architecture. And now for quite some time, I have received commissions as artists, which is very different than receiving commissions as an architect. But also in my own projects, there has been a certain blend between what one may consider art and what one may consider architecture. So I thought that it would be appropriate, particularly for this lecture, to perhaps explore topics about making, about culture, through those lenses. I have always been extremely interested in what happens when we make things with our own hands, the idea of aggregating one brick at a time. But I've also been extremely fascinated with digital technology and the kind of craftsmanship that emerges when you're using digital technology, and in the last 10 years, in particular, robotic fabrication, and the kind of transformations that robotic fabrication is bringing to the construction industry. For me, that relationship between the hand and the tool also translates into a way of thinking about how our bodies encounter the environment around us. So for example, in the design of a dresser, the idea that it might just be a stack of drawers that just has the imprint of your hand as a way of opening it. And then the magic that may come about by suppressing actually the structure that holds those drawers. Or working with new materials. In this case, with a honeycomb that is shaped like a mushroom that allows this screen to be very thin, but also to transform in its section from the bottom to the top of the screen. Or the idea that carbon fiber may allow you to make a table that looks more like a shark than a table, but carbon fiber makes it really light, which means that an older woman can actually lift it and move it around the house, which was what the commission was for this particular project. So in understanding technology, but also understanding how technology can revive certain traditions. The idea that you can now carve from wood in ways that had become prohibitive from a financial point of view, that we can actually recuperate techniques that have been lost through technology. You can actually make figures out of wood in ways that you couldn't before because you couldn't afford it. Working very closely with academic research. This is an installation that I did with students at Georgia Tech, examining how we can think of materials and how to transform them to produce the effect of variation with actually very few elements. So the 10 pieces of particle board created what seemed to be an infinite variation, but it's really an effect. So the relationship between technology and the hand is one that it will always be there. This piece, which was commissioned by the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston, was water jet cut, but actually assembled by hand. And it was assembled by hand in a powder house in an island. So it had to be transported in a boat and carried by hand from the boat to the powder house itself. So demythifying what technology does, and always having that cross-section between technology and the hand, or between technology and natural effects. This is one of the first pieces that I did in collaboration with Wes McGee for using a robotic arm as a way of cutting stone. And you can see that the stone becomes so thin that it almost becomes translucent, and it allows light through it, in my mind, in a very evocative way. So the smaller scale work always informs the larger. The art commissions always inform architecture. Architecture always informs art. And our research in academia always informs both my artistic practice and my architectural practice. This is another installation that I did at Georgia Tech with students. We were looking at cutting plywood into strips and designing the tips of the strips so that they will lock in place, so that we could actually assemble the entire length of the piece without any kind of formwork. So the actual geometry of the tip nicely locked with the next stud. This then informed an interior project, a restaurant in Boston, where we lined the entire space with similar strips of wood as a way of hiding programs such as the wine cellar or the mechanical systems that are hidden in the ceiling, all as a way of transforming that space. I think it's fair to say that I have been known as somebody that is obsessed with aggregating smaller pieces. So when we were commissioned by a client in New York to do a cafeteria in the middle of a tower in Manhattan, I decided to push the idea of the seamless and actually work with no components, no aggregation of pieces, almost as a self-critique of what it would mean to do a smooth surface. And instead, I started working with the notion of aligning all of the different components that normally are in ceilings. If you look up, you'll see that we have sprinkler heads, we have microphones, we have can lights, we have emergency panels, we have a myriad of things that we normally put in ceilings. So what I decided to do was to actually align all of these different components into a single gap, a gap that is just a couple of inches wide. So everything from microphones to sprinkler heads gets actually placed into those crevices. And what generated the curvature in the ceiling is actually not a whim of fancy, but me actually faithfully following the requirements of where the mechanical engineer wanted their diffusers, where the plumber wanted their sprinklers, et cetera, et cetera. But of course, as often in architecture, this is an illusion because the ceiling is made out of different units and different components. So it's an assembly of prefabricated fiberglass panels. And these fiberglass panels then are filled with acoustical wasafon. It's a type of stucco that has acoustical qualities. And then smooth over with a thin layer of plaster. So I couldn't help it, and I wanted to give away the components, and you can see how from panel to panel there is actually a slight differentiation in sheen. So when you visit the cafeteria, you can actually see that it's slightly, you can see the slight differentiations and see that it's panelized. So I have been very fortunate throughout my career that I have been invited by different museums to do installations as part of exhibitions. Very early on, I was invited with my partner at the time, Nader Terrani, by the Museum of Modern Art to do an installation in the garden of the museum. And my thought was to work with a material that normally an architect wouldn't work with, so that we can make a translation of a material manipulation in the context of the artwork around it. We work with 1/8-inch steel, and we work with laser cutting the steel and folding it into place as a way of giving it structural rigidity. We also worked with the idea of perforating it so that it will become lighter and more transparent towards the top. But it was important, since we were in the museum, that we will control the perception of the object and that we will play with optical illusions. So the geometry of the piece was calibrated so that from the bridge, as you cross one of the fountains in the garden, the piece will actually flatten from the three-dimensional and reconstitute itself visually as a sheet of steel. This kind of lesson of how to work with a material with digital technology is something that I've worked to translate into larger projects. So the lessons that we learned from MoMA as to how to fold the metal, as to how to cut it and bend it as a way of producing the effect of variation with digital tools is something that was very much present in this project for the McAllen Building in Boston. It's the largest structure that I worked on. It's a market housing project. And one of the defining factors of the project is that it was next to another residential project for which we had done interiors. And we wanted to make sure that there was enough space between them so that one building would not cast a shadow in the other. It was also important that the common ground, which was common to both buildings, would actually receive as much sun throughout the year as possible. So that actually led to a skinny building that flanked this yard with both buildings facing this court. So skinny buildings, of course, have long histories. All of you have at one point or another been in a double-loaded corridor. And this building is no exception. It's a simple double-loaded corridor. The difference, however, is the zoning called for a shorter building on one of the streets. So as a result, half of our corridors were actually truncated, which meant that we needed to devise a way to unscrew the staircase and tuck it under the roof as a way of still providing the second means of egress in every floor. Now, one of the advantages of that cut is that several apartments on the top then had the advantage of roof terraces. Oops. Terraces that are cut out of the volume of the building and then have views of the bay beyond. So as a result, at the top of the building, you actually get this unexpected relationship to an exterior ground that otherwise you wouldn't have if we had not been forced in a way forced by zoning to cut a quarter of our building. The other advantage of having a building that is low on one side and high in the other is that from the street, from the place that it matters, the high point is actually not imposing. The high point, because of perspective, is actually ends up being tucked away. The other challenge of a skinny building is that you end up having to have a lot of shear walls as a way of preventing the skinny volume from torquing. But we didn't want to block the views, and we definitely could not block the parking, as the parking sat underneath the building. So working in collaboration with a structural engineer, we devised a structural system that to me is an amazing system. It's called a stagger truss system. But as it turns out, it's actually not that big a deal. Apparently, every Howard Johnson in America is built with a stagger truss system. I just didn't know them. And what it means is a honeycomb. Every other floor, the trusses are actually in a different location. Now, what this allowed us to do is not have the amount of sheer walls that we would have had otherwise. But what it does produce is an architectural problem, a Rubik's Cube of sort, or a messed up Rubik's Cube of sort. Because you cannot just stack the same type of unit on top of each other. The trusses get on the way. So instead, we had to weave around the trusses. And that led to us having to line up our plumbing while not aligning our units. So we were able to produce a building that very much reflected the pro forma of the developer and had the right number of units that work with market rate. But we ended up with a very curious aggregation of units inside the building itself. So as a result, our bathrooms and toilets line up from floor to floor, while our unit types don't actually line up from floor to floor. That, in turn, led to a building that does not look like a repetitive stacking of the same on top of each other. That led to a building that has variety on the elevation, because we decided not to put the same window in a bedroom that we would put in a living room. And as such, then you end up with a certain cacophony of windows in the elevation. Now, if you look closely, then you, of course, see the pattern that this window actually repeats here and then actually repeats here, etc. On the street itself, we wanted to work with the brick patterns and the brick tradition that the street had had historically, maintaining the height of the existing buildings, even though we could go a little higher. And then work with the metal facade as one that could actually weave in and out and create the effect of a facade that was actually woven together as opposed to applied on the building. For the brick elevation, we wanted to play a trick, an optical illusion, from having a very thin skin to having a very deep skin. One of the beauties of brick is that you can use it very much as a veneer, but historically has been load-bearing. So we wanted in a single building to call out its history, but actually expose its reality. And most importantly, the building itself in its figure acquires a powerful presence within the city. It's a building that is hard to forget as you arrive into the city, just because of this strange shape of the building receding in space because of that cut. So if digital technology enabled us to do a skin in the McAllen building that was very varied, I was interested in understanding how this kind of mass customization could actually lead to an engagement with the body that might be even more personal than the idea of a varied facade. So when we were commissioned to do the main library for Rhode Island School of Design, I thought that using digital fabrication will give us the opportunity to engage the public user of the library in ways that otherwise we couldn't. The existing space is in the National Register of Historic Places. It's from the 1920s, and it's an old banking hall. We were extremely fortunate that the space itself was in great shape before we arrived. So our job, in a way, was to not mess it up. And I should say that my husband is an expert in historic preservation, and when I was working in the RISD project, we had just started dating, so I was very nervous not to mess it up. So the technique is quite simple. We had the challenge that the program we were asked to put was bigger than the space. So we didn't want to attach the new program to the existing architecture because we thought that that would mess it up. So instead, we decided to set in the floor pavilions, and that these pavilions will house programs within it, but also one of the pavilions you could climb on and then occupy its top, because we were short in square footage. We had more program than space. So we placed the circulation desk and all the circulation services in this pavilion, and then we placed group study rooms, Xerox machines, all this sort of noisy and ugly stuff inside the study pavilion, and then provided common study area on the top of the pavilion. This also allowed us to connect to the mezzanine level of the existing space. This is an existing mezzanine, and we made the mezzanine where periodicals are stored and a reading area. We wanted very much the two pavilions to keep good company with the existing space, but at the same time, we wanted to make it clear that these were new interventions, to not confuse the old with the new. And we thought of the library very much as the living room for the housing above. We were commissioned to do the dormitories for RISD before we got the commission for the library. The dormitories were under construction when we got the commission to do the library itself. So very present in our mind was that the students would be leaving their dorms to come and use the library as their living room at large. So this project, as I said, for us was a way of thinking about mass customization and the possibilities of doing different components that could be adjusted, that could have different relationships with the human body. It also was a way of doing something really low budget and doing it with a very constrained amount of time. So we designed the project as a series of prefabricated modules. All the prefabricated modules were built off-site and then brought to the site and assembled very quickly. Instead of shop drawings, what we developed was a manual for guiding the assembly. All of the pieces were routed digitally by the millwork shop. We produced the drawings that guided the equipment, and then they were assembled at the shop and then delivered to the site. The scale that we used was the scale of a cubicle. So each of the cubicles was prefabricated and then brought to RISD. Who has heard the term universal design here in the audience? Okay, just a handful. So universal design is a critique of ADA. Universal design argues that instead of designing for folks that have a disability versus an ability and dividing the world into able and disabled, that we should be designing the world for various degrees of abilities. So our fascination, or at least my fascination with mass customization, comes from this idea that you may actually design for degrees. as opposed to design for the average. This is a page from Graphic Standards. Those of you that are architects, I'm sure have used this page many a time. And I actually love the page. I love Graphic Standards because it makes life fast and easy. But there is a conceptual problem with this page that translates actually into an actual problem. This page works for the average. You very quickly try to go to the range, and then you try to go to that middle of the range because you think that that middle is actually going to serve more people. But it doesn't. So when we came to design the cubicles, when we came to design the built-in desks, we actually worked with the extremes and everything in between. A little bit tongue-in-cheek for these quick computer stations where this is a standing male and this is a seated female, and again, everything in between. But all of our cubicles, all of our study carrels are a little different in width, a little different in height. The relationship between the desk and the seat is just slightly different. The relationship between the shelf and the desk is just slightly different. And that has led to a different way of occupying the library. Sometimes two students sit where you would not expect the students to sit. Sometimes a student sits in the same spot over and over and over again. Maybe they know why, maybe not, but perhaps it's because that one spot happens to fit their body better. So this idea of having variation so that you can find your spot was something that for us was very important. This also allowed us to develop custom furniture at with a very low budget and develop a language for the furniture in the space. It was also important for us to give the library an identity that will be very specifically RISD. And again, for the architects in the audience, I'm sure that all of you at one point or another have fantasized about buildings like the La Bruce Library or the Boston Public Library, where the names of authors are actually inscribed on the walls. And in the Saint Genevieve, the name of the author actually corresponds to the book behind it, written by that author. How cool is that? So we wanted to work with this tradition, this architectural tradition, of the word somehow embedded as decoration in the architecture. So we developed this idea of perforating our pavilions. And we worked with an alphabet as a means of enabling the librarians to develop their own names to be inscribed. And they decided that the right way to do it would be to inscribe artists, including Rhode Island School of Design alumni, as the names that go into the pavilions themselves. We just developed the letters. They came up with the names. Now, what was really cool about it is that we also put in the names of the librarians, and then they played a joke on us, and they included the names of the team that worked on it. My dog's names are inscribed here. My children, which were just born at this time, are inscribed in here. So the history of the project is also embedded in the piece itself. So there is a cultural translation that technology allows us to do in ways that, again, were possible perhaps in before industrialization, but that had not been possible for many, many decades. And technology is allowing us to have this kind of craftsmanship actually return to design. So this issue of identity and this issue of representing a community, whether it is by inscribing in the architecture, is something that for me is an important and essential component of what architecture does and what an artistic practice should do. I recently was commissioned to do a library for a town in Florida called Pompano Beach. And this town is interesting because it's very segregated. About half of the town is primarily Caucasian. Then more than a quarter is primarily African American, and then the remaining quarter is a little bit more mixed between African Americans and Hispanics. The existing library is in the middle of the Caucasian area of town, and the city decided to move the library really to the junction between the different neighborhoods, the different communities. We were fortunate that we were asked to design not just the building, but also the plaza in front of the building. We were also fortunate that it was not just a library. The city decided to put also a cultural center with the library itself, and not just any cultural center, but actually a media and cultural arts center. This is like a dream commission for me. In the process, we encounter a very curious moment in that we had two clients with two different programs, but sharing a building and sharing a budget. And the head of the Broward County Library System was very insistent that we should put the door in the back of the building, meaning away from the plaza, facing the parking lot. Now, this makes sense. You want your constituents to be able to park and come into the building. The challenge for me is that more than half the constituents, more than half the users of the library were actually coming from public transportation in the front of the building. You can see here our path. So the public transportation was really here, and people were really going to come this way. So for me, the idea that you will design a building that gives its back to the community, it gives its back to public space, was not something that I thought was appropriate for architecture to do. So what we devised was a building with a courtyard, and moreover, a building with a breezeway, so that you could actually have a clear view from the front of the building to the back of the building. We also separated the entrance to the library from the entrance to the cultural center, so that you wouldn't end up with no door at the front. And the city of Pompano Beach was happy with that compromise, because the city of Pompano Beach felt very strongly that there should be a door on the plaza. They were paying for the plaza. They wanted a door on that plaza. So that led to a very open heart of the building, a visual connection between two sides, and then two doors. Something unexpected, something that was not part of the program, something that we were not actually commissioned to do, but it's what architecture can bring to the table. So as a result, we have one entrance to the cultural center, one entrance to the library, but there's something else happened. In the original program, everybody imagined a library on the ground floor and the cultural center on the top. But we realized that that will produce actually dead areas in the ground floor and dead areas on the top floor. The cultural center has some program that is active at night and some program that is active during the day. So what we did is that we actually split the program. Some of the cultural center is on the ground and climbs over. Some of the library is on the ground, and the reading room actually climbs over. And that allows us to do a higher ceiling reading room. The other conversation that happened is that we were requested by the community not to use the typical Spanish style that is prevalent in this area of Florida. And we were also asked not to use an international style. They did not want your typical modern building. And the community was very adamant about this. They felt that it would represent a group of people, but not another. And that was, for me, a very interesting conversation, to have a community feel that a particular style of architecture will not represent them. So instead, we turned to the landscape of Florida and the kind of flora and fauna that is typical of Florida as a source for inspiration, as a way of understanding form in a different way that might actually be more decoupled from what you may expect or what may be more obvious. So the building shows the program climbing up. This is the cultural center climbing up. but then shows the columns then grabbing onto the ground. The glass is not treated in your typical fashion. The glass is in a way looking for a language that is more of a broken skin than a glass curtain wall. The reading room for the children looks out into the sea of columns, again, very much like the character of Mangroves, where the ceiling and the column becomes one and the same. Or the idea that you actually have to score stucco as a way of avoiding expansion cracks when the stucco expands and contracts, and using that pattern to your advantage as a way of developing a language. Or the ceiling of the reading room, where by folding it, not only do you acquire acoustical properties, but you might actually evoke other kinds of surfaces that is not your typical flat ceiling. So for us, the project was very much an exercise of taking your typical materials, your typical Floridian materials, but avoiding multiple associations with historical architecture, whether it's international style or Spanish style, and instead try to evoke other different kinds of references, perhaps more open-ended and perhaps outside of architecture. So this referencing of landscape is something that has always been of interest to me. And the idea that you might actually develop spaces that may evoke spaces that are not necessarily architectural. Or the idea that you may actually develop components that repeat but are not the same, again, evoking a different kind of space, a different kind of landscape. This is a gas station that we did in Los Angeles, and we very much worked with the idea of transforming one structural element in multiple ways. And that structural element could transform because of the way that we did the geometry of the cladding, so that it can be a perfect column, or it can fatten up to house the place where you pay for your gas, or it can be chopped up in an edge when it comes to the edge of the street, or it can pull away simply to allow for a billboard. So this opening up of multiple references, I think, is an important trajectory for art and architecture, and the idea that you can, through repetition, but also through referencing nature, move away from a particular association of a particular figure. I was commissioned by the General Services Administration to do an art piece in a courthouse in Montana, and these are all the districts that this courthouse services. All these people have to travel to Billings, Montana, when they have a case, a federal case, to either bring to trial or be trialed for. So when I got the commission, I was very interested in this idea of the landscape and the cuts in the landscape and the kind of figures that rivers and waterways make on the landscape itself. So I decided to work with the idea of the lines and weaving them the same way that they're woven in nature. There is, of course, very much a Native American tradition of weaving leather and weaving rope that also influenced the thinking. And the way that the landscapes are eroded and the way that the forms are eroded throughout Montana is just spectacular. And this kind of figure was also very present in my thinking. So we worked on the idea of designing a floating structure that was made out of woven metal that could actually glow at night by simply hanging mylar cones in its connections. The form itself, we carefully calibrated. We very much wanted it to be evocative of multiple references, all within the state, so that it could speak differently to anyone that is coming to the courthouse. The way that we hung these little cones, again, the intent is that as light hits it, but also as you come close to it, you may actually have different and multiple associations. And this power of creating associations is, for me, what is important about constructing culture and building and design. What is, again, interesting about building in 3 dimensions is that you're always affecting space. And the idea that space actually implies a particular community, space actually implies a particular set of beliefs, space actually embodies how we think of the world. This is a film still from the movie Metropolis. And what is very powerful about it is that you can actually see a whole world inside. There is the balconies that stack up. There is elevators that bring you up. There is nature being caught. You can see the trees, right? There is the people. These are actually themes that have been very present in 20th century hotel architecture. This is a Pullman Hotel in Atlanta, and you can see the same things in just one image. So when we were commissioned to renovate an existing embassy suites in Lower Manhattan right after 9/11, I was very excited about the prospect. But you can see that the hotel we got was not as sexy as either of the images that I just showed. Drywall construction, very, very poorly built, just really base construction. And a very relentless, repetitive balcony system, very oppressive. You can sort of see the nature being caught right here. But the potential for the project is that it was in Lower Manhattan. This is the corner of where the Twin Towers used to be. This is the Potato Famine Memorial. This is the ferry terminal. So an amazing location. Also, Battery Park has a zoning regulation that requires every building to provide a public ground that is elevated 1 floor from the street. In our case, this public ground had really become privatized. The right-of-way of the public ground is only like 5 feet wide, and they very literally put it, on the edge. So the connection was really just 2 escalators. So it was not really public. Big wall with a nice piece of art, but big wall, and then just 2 escalators as its connection to the public. So we thought that it would be important to reclaim that connection, to actually connect through the building and make the intent of the zoning its true nature. So we went ahead and we blasted through the walls in both ends, placed really large public staircases, Piazza de España Roman style, so that that ground can then come and meet the public ground of the street. So we went from something this narrow to something that was really wide and open. We also decided to extend the public ground as much as possible inside the building or under the building at that level. So one of the exciting things about the project is that inside the building from the 80s was a Solduit drawing, 14 stories high, and the full length of the atrium. And this Solduit drawing, which you can only see a strip here, is very difficult to photograph, really was applied to the mass of a multiplex theater. This is a very weird building. You have the hotel wrapping a multiplex building, and its geometry is the result of the streets around it. So one of our challenges became what to do with the space itself and how to transform the space so that the Solduit could then reconnect to other artworks that are present and available to the public on the site. You can see that the Solduit really commands the space, but by the same token, it feels really constrained. It's like the space is really torturing the Solduit. So how to handle such a thing respectfully and how to intervene on it without cutting it, chopping it, or doing it a disservice. So we worked very hard with the notion of a proscenium, the idea of a three-dimensional frame that was not like in a conventional theater, a two-dimensional opening, like in this, like the one that I'm standing in right now, but more like a Cirque du Soleil, three-dimensional proscenium that you could actually move around and in between. We also became interested in the idea of translucency, luminosity, and the effects the natural effects that happen when you get different kind of condensation, whether in glass or just through smog. And we looked at architectural installations in art fairs and the kind of folly that they make. These are always temporary. Could we make a permanent version of it? So we thought of filling the space as opposed to leaving a void and filling it with a series of veils. And we keep on talking about this project as the hanging veils. And in that way, it allowed us to break the scale, the 14 stories of the space, which feels really oppressive, and instead enter a conversation with the silhouette drawing. For the geometry of the veils, we took clues from the geometry of the site, which is, of course, present in the building because of the angle of the silhouette. So the veils are triangular, and again, they are generated by that moment that moment in which the silhouette clashes against the building. To make the veils stable, we had to put a ring at the bottom, and this ring brings light to the lobby itself at night. The balconies were modified. We cut them out so that when you walk through a balcony, you can actually get a clear view down towards the veils. And that allows the veils to be experienced very differently depending on where you are in the building. We also borrowed this language into other areas of the building, but transformed it. So our staircases in the conference center becomes almost a frozen version of the veils, this time clad in wood. So this idea of suspension is a theme that then becomes pervasive throughout the building. But we also wanted to make sure that we had a definition for the space of the lobby. So the lower rings really make almost like a canopy over the seating so that you can feel comfortable once you're seated in. We also had the challenge of how to manipulate the upper frame. In my previous drawings, you saw it as flat. We discovered late in the game that we actually had to put a basket through the upper frame to clean the skylights. We had been told that that was not necessary, and in the last minute, the client changed their mind. But that provided a beautiful opportunity because it allowed us to create yet another level of conversation with the silhouette drawing. Thank you. I would love questions.
Just got a really pragmatic question. What is that structural system in the veils? What is that, the actual structure made of?
Aluminum.
Cool.
It's painted aluminum. Very light. One of the challenges for the project, I should have said at the beginning that I worked in collaboration with KPF for the renovation of the hotel rooms themselves. The veils was an art commission. The balconies was an architectural commission. And then the interiors, I worked as a consultant to the interior designer. So talk about interdisciplinarity. So the structure of the upper frame and of the lower frame is aluminum. The cables themselves is a fiber, and it's a translucent fiber. So actually light travels across it, which makes it very ephemeral, but it's also one of the reasons it's so hard to photograph, because they look either too solid or they disappear on you. So.
Thank you so much for being here. I loved listening to your talk today. You mentioned in the beginning that part of your thinking process is to unveil the technologies you use to build, and it seems to me often we think of technology as particularly good at veiling its own processes, right? And I just wanted you to sort of comment on that. If you think about the technology itself, one step before the building process.
For me, technology is all a continuum. We get very excited about digital technology because we are in that moment. But for me, it's the same as power tools. It's the same as handcraft. So to choose the right tool, the right technique for the right project is extremely important. And then there are moments where, because of my academic background, I know that a particular technique is the right one for this project, and I argue for it with a client. Rhode Island School of Design was a great experience because, given the schedule, we needed to start construction in January and be completely done by June. Very fast pace in terms of construction. I was at that time doing research at Georgia Tech, so I knew that this was the right technology. And it was widespread. CNC routing, digital technology has been in the millwork industry for decades. But it's hard to tell a client all of these components should be prefabricated with digitally guided tools, and you need to really work with, these are the few contractors that you should be interviewing for this particular project. But I already had a relationship with RISD because we had done the dormitories. So there was a certain level of trust already there. So we developed the process together. We interviewed the contractors together. In turn, the contractor and us interviewed the mill shop together. So we developed the process together. And as a result, the project was very cheap, very inexpensive, and it was really fast, very quickly done. So, and it's maintained really well. The librarian is very proud of how well the space has been maintained. So I hope that answers the question, or maybe not.
So in regards to mass customization, have you found contractors willing to work with that?
Yes, yes.
If you could just speak to that
Yes.
process.
The machine does not care what shape it cuts. It's the same amount of time for the machine to do this and to do it backwards and to do it a little bigger, a little smaller. I mean, there are boundaries beyond which is no longer the same amount of time. But But pretty much within a range, the machine really doesn't care what it's cutting. And it's going to cut the same. It's going to cost the same to do, a wiggly line this wide and to do a wiggly line a little narrower. They're not big price differences, right? So what really costs a premium is the time of assembly, the time of setup for the cut, and then the time of assembly. So what we do is that we develop partnerships with the fabricators. We do a lot of the drawing up front, which is similar to the kind of drawing we are doing for design. We just translate it into the right kind of software. So we do a lot of the drawing in partnership with the fabricator. And then we design it in a simple way so that it's easy to assemble. Again, I'll use RISD. For RISD, there were no shop drawings. Instead, we provided our digital files to the fabricator, already flattened out. The fabricator reviewed our files and made sure that our lines were closed so that when it went through the machine, we wouldn't end up with unfinished cuts. They were legally responsible because they checked our drawings, so they became their drawings, right? So it's their liability insurance that covered a mistake. Sorry, it's important. And that was an agreement, right? I mean, we discussed it right up front, who is going to be liable. And he said, it has to be me because I have to check it, and I'm cutting it. I don't want you. How am I going to get your insurance company to pay for my equipment if something goes wrong? So instead of shop drawings that have a gazillion dimensions, and then if you do every piece different, where do you end, right? We provided the drawings directly, and the fabricator didn't care what size something was, as long as the assembly system was all the same. So once we came up with the design of the cubicles and the assembly of all the cubicles were all the same, then it became a very easy assembly process. They were all brought to site. I was there on a Tuesday, and I came back a week later, and they had already finished assembling. So I was really disappointed that I saw the cubicles arrive, nicely wrapped, and I never actually saw them put them together. So that was disappointing. But very quick. And then also a lot of quality control, right? Because you're doing one after another, and if you break something, you can just remake it right then and there. You don't have to wait for somebody to bring a new piece in. So, it also gave us flexibility in the relationship to the client. We came up with the idea of embedding the names quite late. The president of RISD, very late in the process, came to us and said, I feel these are too massive. I think it might actually oppress the space too much. And we thought, he has a point. That's why we quickly developed an alphabet, and the contractor priced the alphabet, and he said, well, within this budget you get, I forget, 32,000 characters, I think is what he said. And the librarians developed a list of names with those numbers of characters. If we were doing that with older technology, that wouldn't have been possible. But this technology already at that time was available, widely available everywhere. This is how mill workshops were already working. So they already had the equipment. They were already thinking in that fashion. By us having done academic research on it, we could talk their language. So the answer is yes, very receptive. Right now, I've been working in the last few years again with robotic fabrication. The piece that I showed in Montana, the sculpture that I showed in Montana was actually bent by a robotic arm and then welded by hand, and then we wrapped the welds with leather. And then all of the cones were actually cut by a digitally guided knife cutter called the zoom cutter. And then we folded it by hand. And now I'm working on the skin for a building that is going to be robotic fabricated. And it's a guy that does cars. It's not a building fabricator, because building fabricators don't have robotic capabilities yet. So if you learn the technology and you work with the fabricators within their means, definitely. They're very interested. It differentiates them from their competitors. They're in the business because they love building, right? So it gives them something exciting to work with.
Hi, what other architects, past or present, do you find particularly interesting or inspirational?
So many. I don't know where to start. I'm going to give you two personal ones. I'm from Caracas, Venezuela. So I grew up in a city where exposed reinforced concrete was the norm. I know that here in Cleveland, some reinforced concrete buildings have been demolished. I think it's a shame because I grew up with them. So for me, they're warm and fuzzy. They're not cold and brutalist. So, so one Venezuelan architect that I grew up admiring is Carlos Raúl Villanueva. And he did exposed concrete buildings that are just, in my mind, of course, phenomenal, but I'm from Venezuela. So he would be one. There is an Italian architect that did a house in Venezuela, but is extremely well known in Italy, Gio Ponte. And I did an exhibition of his work. When I was at Harvard, I did an exhibition of his work. I lived down the street from the house he did in Caracas, Venezuela, even though he's Italian. And he's an amazing, for me, he's an amazing role model. So it's more personal than anything, because he was the dean of a school of architecture in Milan at the same time that he was a practicing architect. He had a great deal of attention to detail. But he also did interiors. I love doing interiors. He also did art. He also did industrial design. And all of it had a lot of integrity, always thinking very carefully of what material you use when and why, and always thinking of the user, always thinking of the family, the public, etc. So those will be two, from a personal point of view, that I find particularly inspirational because of my own background. But there are many. There are so many. Are you talking about alive or dead?
Either.
Oh, okay, because I gave you two dead ones. Alive, many, many, many. So.
We'll take one more question, please.
Hello, thank you very much for your conversation. It's wonderful. I'm a student at the School of Law, and I'm very interested in art and rehabilitation. So I had a question regarding that. I have to read it because it's a little bit long. But so much of architecture is premised in how the body encounters space.
Yeah.
But I was wondering if you could focus on what space does to the mind, and if you believe that occupying space has transformative power. For example, do you think that, you know, a criminal being in a specific space could straighten him up and integrate him back into society, or a sick person who has some really bizarre disease can occupy a certain space and then be healed from that?
That's a fantastic question. I don't think that architecture or art are a magic bullet. In other words, I don't think that you design the right perfect room and you put the person in that room, they are going to be transformed magically. But I do think that architecture does influence how we live in a very profound way. It does affect our relationships. It does affect our thinking about the world. I think the single family home or the apartment that you grew in is a good example of that. The way that it enables or prevents relationships among family members is extremely powerful. The way that it prevents or enables relationships between you and your neighbors and your community is undeniable, right? There is a lot of research on the impact of art and architecture in health, on health, and how basic things like light, views, noise or lack of noise, certain colors really help those who are sick get better and reduces stay in hospitals. But I don't think it's a magic bullet. I think that is a complex system that leads to a better life. But it's not a single answer, not a simple, not a simple answer. The piece in the courthouse we did a lot of work with the head judge. She actually was at the court in South Africa before she commissioned us with the work, and she brought back multiple examples of artwork throughout the court in South Africa that are extremely powerful. So one of the things that was important for us was for the piece to be really delicate and for the piece to really float and move slowly and quietly in the space. This courthouse is a rough courthouse. You have people that are here because they were beat by their husband. You have here children that were abused by their families. You have here people that committed incredible crimes because of alcoholism, right? So there is the victims on both sides of the equation. So we wanted to make sure that that lobby, where either family members of somebody that committed a crime or somebody who is waiting to face their, face that who had committed a crime against them, will be peaceful and will be quiet. So does our piece have the power to heal? I don't think so. I don't have that kind of, I don't know. I don't think, I don't have that kind of pretension. But we very much wanted to make sure that it did inspire multiple references, multiple associations. You might see a flower or you might not see a flower on the piece, as a way of making sure that it was respectful of the context. So, great question. Thank you so much.